Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're embarking on a chilling journey into one of the most disturbing and infamous true crime cases in American history, the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. The name Jeffrey Dahmer sends shivers down the spine. He's become synonymous with unspeakable evil, a figure who embodies the darkest depths of human depravity. His crimes weren't just murders, they were acts of unimaginable brutality, necrophilia, and cannibalism that shocked the world and left an indelible scar on the city of Milwaukee. But beyond the headlines and the sensationalism, who was Jeffrey Dahmer? What drove him to commit such horrific acts? And how did he manage to operate undetected for over a decade? In this video, we won't just recount the events. We're going to delve deep. We'll dissect his journey into darkness, examining his troubled childhood, his escalating acts of violence, and the chilling rituals he performed. We'll trace the investigation step by step, exposing the systemic failures and the tragic oversights that allowed Dahmer to continue his reign of terror. We'll hear from the perspective of the victims, their families, and the investigators who were forever changed by this case. We will also dive deep into the complex and disturbing psychology of a serial killer. We'll explore the theories that attempt to explain his behavior, examine the latest research in forensic psychology, and discuss the crucial steps we can take to prevent such tragedies from happening again. This is not just a story about a monster. It's a story about the darkness that can reside within us, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring quest for justice and understanding. So, prepare yourselves. This is going to be a difficult journey, but it's a necessary one. We must confront the darkness to understand it, and we must remember the victims to honor their memory and learn from the past. Let's begin. 2. The Journey into Darkness G. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 23, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At first glance, his early life might seem unremarkable, even ordinary. But beneath the surface, a darkness was brewing, a darkness that would eventually consume him and lead to the deaths of 17 innocent young men. From a young age, Dahmer exhibited unusual behaviors. Classmates and neighbors later recalled his fascination with dissecting dead animals, a disturbing hobby that foreshadowed his later atrocities. This wasn't just childish curiosity. It was something deeper, something more sinister. He would collect roadkill, meticulously dissect the animals, and even dissolve their bones in acid, a chilling precursor to his later methods of disposing of his victims. The first victim, Stephen Hicks, June 18, 1978. The unraveling begins. Dahmer was 18, fresh out of high school, when he committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker. Dahmer lured Hicks to his home with the promise of beer. As the evening wore on and Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer in a moment that would forever alter the course of his life and the lives of many others, struck him with a barbell and then strangled him to death. What's particularly disturbing is what happened next. Dahmer, seemingly calm and collected, proceeded to dismember Hicks' body. He then buried parts of the remains in his backyard and crushed the bones, scattering them in a nearby ravine. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated, methodical, and deeply disturbing. It revealed a level of depravity that was shocking, especially for someone so young. Let's analyze this from different perspectives. Imagine being Stephen Hicks. You're young, hitchhiking, perhaps looking for adventure. You meet a seemingly harmless guy who offers you a drink. You trust him, go to his house, and then, in a terrifying instant, everything changes. Your life is brutally taken from you. Your dreams, your future, extinguished in a moment of unimaginable violence. The sheer terror and helplessness that Hicks must have felt are difficult to comprehend. Now, let's try to understand Dahmer's perspective, not to excuse his actions, but to try to grasp the darkness within him. This was his first murder. The act of killing, the dismemberment, it wasn't just about ending a life. It was about control, about possession, about fulfilling a dark fantasy that had been brewing inside him. The meticulous way he disposed of the body suggests a chilling awareness of his actions and a desire to keep them hidden, to continue living a double life. This murder set the stage for his future crimes. It was the crossing of a line, a descent into a darkness from which there would be no return. He had tasted the power, the control, and he would crave it again and again. The 9-year hiatus, a dormant evil, following the murder of Stephen Hicks. Dahmer entered a period of apparent dormancy, a 9-year hiatus during which he didn't kill. But this wasn't a period of reformation or remorse. It was a period of internal struggle, a time when the darkness within him continued to fester. He enlisted in the army, but was discharged due to his escalating alcohol problem. He drifted from job to job, living a seemingly aimless life, but all the while, his dark desires were simmering beneath the surface. He moved between Ohio, Florida, and back to Wisconsin, attempting to hold down jobs, but failing repeatedly. His alcoholism worsened, leading to arrests for indecent exposure and disorderly conduct. These were cries for help, signs of a deeply troubled individual, but they went largely unheeded. What was Dahmer doing during these 9 years? Was he fighting his urges? Was he planning his next move? We can only speculate. But it's likely that this period was a crucial stage in the development of his pathology. He was honing his fantasies, refining his methods, and perhaps even stalking potential victims. The darkness was growing stronger, waiting for the opportune moment to erupt again. This period also offers a glimpse into a potential turning point. Could intervention during this time have prevented future tragedies? If his alcoholism and increasingly erratic behavior had been addressed seriously, could Dahmer's path have been altered? These are difficult questions with no easy answers, but they highlight the importance of recognizing and addressing warning signs, especially when they involve substance abuse and deviant behavior. It's a chilling thought that during this supposed hiatus, the monster within Dahmer was merely lying dormant, gathering strength for its horrifying resurgence. He was like a volcano, seemingly inactive on the surface, but with a molten core of evil churning beneath, ready to erupt with devastating force. The Return of the Monster, Stephen Toomey, November 20th, 1970, are a descent into further depravity in 1987. The monster reawakened. Dahmer, now 27, met Stephen Toomey, a 25-year-old man, at a gay bar in Milwaukee. He lured Toomey back to a hotel room where he drugged and strangled him. This time, however, the horror didn't end with murder. Dahmer dismembered Toomey's body in the hotel room and later transported the remains back to his grandmother's house in garbage bags. He eventually disposed of most of the body but kept Toomey's skull, a gruesome trophy that marked a terrifying escalation in his depravity. This murder marked a significant turning point. Dahmer was no longer just killing. He was experimenting, indulging in his darkest fantasies. The retention of the skull suggests a growing fascination with death, a desire to possess and control his victims even beyond death. It was a trophy, a memento of his power, and a chilling symbol of his descent into further depravity. He had crossed another line. The act of murder was no longer enough. He needed more. He was becoming increasingly consumed by his need for control, for possession, for a complete and utter domination over his victims. He would later claim that he had blacked out during the murder and did not remember committing it. Wyatt, his methodical actions of hiding the body and transporting the remains back home demonstrated a certain level of awareness. The Killing Spree, 1988-1991. A Reign of Terror from 1988 to 1991. Dahmer embarked on a horrific killing spree, claiming the lives of 15 more young men. This was the darkest period of his reign of terror, a time when his apartment became a chamber of horrors, a place where unspeakable acts were committed. His victims were predominantly young, gay men of color, individuals he believed were less likely to be missed, less likely to be searched for. He preyed on their vulnerability, their desire for connection, and their trust. He would often meet them in bars, malls, or on the street, luring them back to his apartment with promises of money, alcohol, or companionship. Once inside, they were trapped. He would drug them, often using sedatives or sleeping pills, rendering them unconscious and helpless. Jamie Dockstader, January 1988, Kyo, just 14 years old. A child. Dahmer's descent into utter depravity is horrifically clear here. He not only murdered Dockstader, but kept his skull, another trophy for his collection. Imagine the terror of a child, lured by a seemingly friendly face, only to meet such a horrific end. What does it say about Dahmer that he could prey on someone so young and vulnerable? The innocence of youth, juxtaposed with the utter darkness of Dahmer's soul, creates a sickening contrast. He was no longer just a killer. He was a predator of the most vulnerable. Richard Guerrero, March 24, 1988, 25 years old. Dahmer's pattern is becoming established. He's targeting a specific demographic, exploiting the societal prejudices of the time. Guerrero was likely just looking for connection, for acceptance, and instead, he found a monster. Dahmer's choice of victims speaks to a calculated cruelty, a targeting of those he perceived as less likely to be missed by a society that often marginalized and ignored them. Anthony Sears, March 25, 989, 24 years old. This is where the experimentation begins. Drilling into the skull, injecting acid. These were not just acts of murder. They were acts of torture, of a twisted scientific curiosity. Dahmer was trying to create a zombie, a living being completely under his control. It's a terrifying glimpse into his desire for absolute power over another human being. Imagine the agony Sears endured, the sheer horror of being conscious during such a barbaric act. This wasn't just about death. It was about inflicting unimaginable suffering. Raymond Smith, aka Ricky Beeks, May 20, 1990, Clay, 33 years old. Dahmer kept Smith's skull and genitals. The trophies are becoming more significant, more personal. He's not just collecting body parts. He's collecting pieces of his victims' identities. It's a form of possession that goes beyond death, a way to keep them with him, to relive the power he felt over them. 400 words. Edward W. Smith, June 14, 1990, 28 years old. Another skull added to the collection. Each skull represents a life extinguished, a story cut short. Each one is a testament to Dahmer's growing depravity, a symbol of his insatiable hunger for death and control. Ernest Miller, September 1990, King, 22 years old. Dahmer's becoming more efficient, more practiced in his methods of dismemberment. The horror has become routine for him, a chilling indication of how desensitized he has become to violence and death. He is no longer a man, he is a machine of destruction. David C. Thomas, September 24, 1990, King, 23 years old. Dahmer is now keeping smaller body parts, perhaps for study, perhaps for consumption. The lines between murder, science, and cannibalism are becoming blurred. It's a descent into a madness so profound that it's difficult to comprehend. Curtis Straughter, February 1991, 18 years old. Another young life extinguished. Another skull added to Dahmer's collection. Each victim is not just a number. They are individuals with families, friends, dreams, and aspirations. They were sons, brothers, friends, and their loss left a void that could never be filled. Errol Lindsay, April 7, 1991, 19 years old. Another attempt at creating a zombie. The drilling, the acid, the utter disregard for human suffering. This highlights the experimental nature of Dahmer's crimes. He was driven by a morbid curiosity, a desire to push the boundaries of his control, to see just how far he could go. The fact that he continued these experiments after failing before speaks to an obsessive need to dominate and control, even in the face of repeated failure. Anthony Hughes, May 24, 1991, co-131 years old. Deaf and mute. Dahmer's choice of a vulnerable victim, someone who couldn't scream for help, further demonstrates his cruelty. He was not just killing. He was choosing victims who were less able to defend themselves, less able to fight back. This was a calculated choice, a deliberate act of targeting the vulnerable. Konarak synthesophone, May 27, 1991, Goten, 14 years old. This case particularly heartbreaking and infuriating. Synthesophone managed to escape, drugged and disoriented, only to be returned to Dahmer by the police. This tragic failure of the system allowed Dahmer to claim one more victim. It's a stark reminder of the consequences of negligence and prejudice. A child, desperately seeking help, was handed back to his tormentor. The pain and terror he must have felt in his final hours are unimaginable. This is a case that should haunt us all, a reminder that we must do better to protect the vulnerable among us. Matt Turner, June 30, 1991, 20 years old. The dismemberment continues. The routine of death. Dahmer has become a factory of horror, efficiently processing his victims, turning human beings into objects to be dissected and discarded. Jeremiah Weyenberger, July 5, 1991, 23 years old. Another life, another story, another victim of Dahmer's insatiable need to kill and control. The sheer number of victims is staggering, each one representing a unique tragedy, a life cut short by unimaginable violence. Oliver Lacey, July 15, 1901, 23 years old. The penultimate victim. The killing spree is nearing its end, but the horror continues. Each murder is a fresh wound on the soul of the city, a reminder of the monster that lurked among them. Joseph Braidhoft, July 19, 1991, 25 years old. The final victim. The end of Dahmer's reign of terror, but the beginning of a long and painful process of healing for the families and the community. The sheer relief that it was over, that no more lives would be taken, must have been immense. But the scars would remain, a constant reminder of the evil that had walked among them. During this period, Dahmer engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. He kept body parts as trophies, skulls, and other skeletal remains. He even attempted to create zombies by drilling holes into his victims, skulls, and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to render them completely submissive to his will. These weren't just murders, they were rituals, experiments in depravity. Dahmer was no longer just a killer. He was a monster, a predator who reveled in the suffering of his victims. The sheer brutality of these acts is difficult to comprehend. It's a level of evil that defies logic and reason. It's the stuff of nightmares, the kind of horror that most people can't even imagine. But for Dahmer, it was reality. It was his life. The rituals of a madman. Beyond murder, Dahmer's crimes were characterized by a series of disturbing rituals that went far beyond the act of murder. These rituals offer a chilling glimpse into the depths of his depravity and the twisted logic of his mind. He engaged in necrophilia, having sexual intercourse with the corpses of his victims. This wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about control, about possession, about dominating his victims even after death. He also practiced cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims' bodies. He claimed that he did this because he wanted to feel that they were a part of him, that they would be with him forever. It was a twisted form of intimacy, a way to merge with his victims on a physical and perhaps even spiritual level. He meticulously documented his crimes, taking photographs of his victims in various poses, both before and after death. These photographs were not just trophies. They were a way for him to relive his crimes, to recapture the thrill of the kill, the feeling of power and control. He kept body parts, particularly skulls, which he would often clean and preserve. These were his souvenirs, his mementos of death, tangible reminders of his power of his victims. These rituals were not random acts. They were a deliberate and integral part of Dahmer's crimes. They were a way for him to express his darkest desires, to fulfill his twisted fantasies, and to exert ultimate control over his victims, even in death. They were the actions of a man consumed by darkness, a man who had lost all touch with humanity. 3. The investigation and capture it, a trail of missed opportunities. The investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes is a story of missed opportunities, systemic failures, and ultimately a triumph of perseverance. For years, Dahmer operated in the shadows, his crimes largely unnoticed by a police department that, at the time, was accused of being indifferent to the disappearances of young, gay, and minority men. The ignored warnings. A community in the dark. The warning signs were there, but they were largely ignored. Neighbors reported foul odors emanating from Dahmer's apartment. Strange noises in the night, but their complaints were often dismissed or not taken seriously. This was a community that felt marginalized, ignored by the authorities, and their concerns about a possible predator in their midst were tragically validated. The stench of death, the sounds of violence, these were not subtle clues. They were blatant indicators of something horrific happening within the walls of Dahmer's apartment. Yet, they were overlooked, dismissed as nuisances rather than investigated as potential evidence of serious crimes. This was not just a failure of the police. It was a failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members. Imagine living in that building, smelling that smell, hearing those sounds, and feeling that growing sense of dread, but having your concerns dismissed by those sworn to protect you. It's a terrifying thought, a betrayal of trust that would have lasting consequences. It's a stark reminder that we must listen to the voices of marginalized communities, that we must take their concerns seriously, and that we must never allow prejudice or indifference to blind us to the possibility of danger. The failure to act on these warnings is a stain on the city of Milwaukee, a tragic example of how systemic biases can have deadly consequences. It's a lesson that we must never forget. The community knew something was wrong, and their cries for help were ignored. The case of Conorak Synthesomphone. A systemic failure, perhaps the most egregious example of police negligence in the Dahmer case, is the tragic incident involving 14-year-old Conorak Synthesomphone. In May 1991, a dazed and naked synthesomphone, having escaped from Dahmer's apartment after being drugged and subjected to horrific torture, was found on the street by police officers. Despite the pleas of two concerned black women who had found the boy and called for help, and despite his obvious distress and injuries, the officers believed Dahmer's fabricated story that Synthesomphone was his 19-year-old lover and that they'd had a drunken quarrel. They returned the boy to Dahmer's apartment, effectively handing him back to his murderer. This incident is a stain on the Milwaukee Police Department. It's a horrifying example of how prejudice, indifference, and a lack of diligence can lead to deadly consequences. These officers had a chance to save a life, to stop a monster, but they failed. They failed to listen to the concerned citizens who were trying to help. They failed to properly assess the situation, and they failed to protect a vulnerable child. The officers' actions were later scrutinized, and although they were fired, they were eventually reinstated. This incident sparked outrage and protests, highlighting the deep racial and social divisions within the city and the lack of trust between the minority community and the police. It's a stark reminder of the importance of thorough investigations, of listening to all voices, and of treating every individual with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, sexual orientation, or social status. The failure to save Conorak Synthesomphone is a tragedy that will forever be linked to the Dahmer case, a symbol of the systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate unchecked for so long. It is important to note that this incident led to calls for reform within the Milwaukee Police Department and increased scrutiny on how missing persons cases, especially involving minorities, were handled. Tracy Edwards, the one who got away in the turning point in the case, came on July 22, 1991, thanks to the bravery and quick thinking of Tracy Edwards. Edwards, then 32, had been lured to Dahmer's apartment, just like so many others before him. But Edwards was different. He sensed the danger, he saw the signs, and he refused to become another victim. He noticed the foul smell, the boxes of hydrochloric acid, and the disturbing photographs on the walls. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs on his wrist, and he heard the chilling threats from Dahmer. But he kept his cool, he played along, and he waited for his opportunity. When Dahmer was momentarily distracted, Edwards made his move. He punched Dahmer, fled the apartment, and flagged down 2 police officers on the street. This time, the police listened. This time, they acted. Edwards' courage and quick thinking not only saved his own life, but also brought an end to Dahmer's reign of terror. He is a true hero, a man who stared into the face of evil and refused to back down. His story is a testament to the power of human resilience, the will to survive, and the importance of listening to one's instincts. If not for Edwards, Dahmer would likely have continued to kill, adding more names to his list of victims. Tracy Edwards is a name that should be remembered, a name that should be celebrated, for he is the one who finally brought the monster to justice. The arrest and the apartment of horrors. Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment, and what they found inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie, a real-life nightmare. The stench of death and decay hung heavy in the air. Photographs of mutilated bodies adorned the walls. A human head was found in the refrigerator. Several more were found in the freezer. A 57-gallon drum filled with acid and decomposing body parts was discovered in a corner. Skulls and skeletal remains were scattered throughout the apartment. It was a scene of unimaginable horror, a testament to the sheer depravity of the man who had lived there. The officers, hardened professionals trained to deal with the darkest aspects of human behavior, were stunned into silence. They had stumbled upon the lair of a monster, a place where unspeakable acts had been committed. The sheer scale of the horror was overwhelming. It was as if they had stepped into another dimension, a dimension of pure evil. The discovery of these remains confirmed the worst fears of the community and provided irrefutable evidence of Dahmer's crimes. This was no longer a case of missing persons. It was a mass murder investigation of unprecedented proportions. The arrest was surprisingly anticlimactic. Dahmer, confronted with the evidence of his crimes, offered little resistance. He was arrested and taken into custody, finally brought to justice after years of operating in the shadows. It was as if a spell had been broken, as if the city could finally breathe again, knowing that the monster was no longer among them. The confession, a chilling account. Following his arrest, Dahmer confessed to his crimes in a series of chilling interviews with police. He detailed his methods, his motives, and his macabre rituals, providing a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a serial killer. His confessions were remarkably candid, almost clinical in their detachment. He described how he had lured his victims, how he had drugged them, how he had killed them, and how he had disposed of their bodies. He spoke of his experiments, his attempts to create zombies, his acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, all with a chilling lack of remorse. He spoke of his desire for control, his need to possess his victims completely, even in death. He claimed that he had been driven by an overwhelming loneliness, a need for companionship that he could only satisfy through murder and subsequent acts of perversion. His confessions provided invaluable insight into the workings of his mind, helping investigators to understand the motivations and methods behind his crimes. They also provided a sense of closure for the families of the victims, although nothing could ever truly compensate for their loss. The confessions were also instrumental in securing a conviction. Dahmer, despite initially pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, eventually changed his plea to guilty but insane. He was ultimately found to be legally sane at the time of his crimes and was convicted of 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a sentence that ensured he would never again walk free. The trial was a media sensation, drawing attention from around the world. It was a public reckoning with evil, a chance for society to confront the darkness that had been lurking in its midst. 4. The psychology of a serial killer. Understanding the darkness, what drives a person to commit such horrific acts? What turns a seemingly ordinary individual into a monster like Jeffrey Dahmer? These are questions that have plagued criminologists, psychologists, and forensic psychiatrists for decades. In this section, we'll delve into the complex and disturbing psychology of a serial killer, exploring the various theories that attempt to explain Dahmer's behavior and examining the latest research in the field. A troubled childhood seeds of evil. Many experts believe that Dahmer's troubled childhood played a significant role in the development of his psychopathology. His early years were marked by instability, neglect, and a profound sense of isolation. His parents' marriage was tumultuous, characterized by frequent arguments and emotional distance. His mother, Joyce, suffered from mental health issues, while his father, Lionel, was often described as emotionally unavailable. As a young boy, Dahmer was described as shy, withdrawn, and isolated. He had few friends and struggled to connect with his peers. He found solace in solitary activities, such as collecting and dissecting dead animals, a disturbing hobby that foreshadowed his later crimes. Some biographers have pointed to a hernia operation Dahmer underwent at a young age as a possible contributing factor to his emotional detachment and social awkwardness. Others have suggested that his mother's use of prescription drugs during her pregnancy may have had an impact on his neurological development. While these factors alone cannot fully explain the development of such a profoundly disturbed individual, they likely contributed to his sense of alienation and his difficulty in forming healthy relationships. It's important to note that not everyone who experiences a difficult childhood becomes a serial killer. However, in Dahmer's case, the combination of a troubled family life, social isolation, and early exposure to death and dismemberment may have created a fertile ground for the development of his dark fantasies and ultimately his horrific crimes. The role of fantasy. Fueling the fire. Fantasy played a crucial role in the development of Dahmer's pathology. From a young age, he retreated into a world of dark fantasies, where he had complete control over others. These fantasies often involved violence, death, and sexual domination. As he grew older, these fantasies became more elaborate, more detailed, and more central to his life. He would spend hours lost in his own mind, imagining scenarios where he would lure, drug, and kill his victims. He would visualize himself performing acts of necrophilia and cannibalism, deriving a twisted sense of pleasure and power from these imagined acts. For Dahmer, these fantasies were not just a form of escapism. They were a rehearsal for his crimes. They were a way for him to plan his attacks, to refine his methods, and to fuel his desire to kill. The fantasies became so powerful, so consuming, that they eventually spilled over into reality. He was no longer content to simply imagine these acts. He needed to experience them, to make them real. This is a common pattern among serial killers. Fantasy provides a safe space to explore their darkest desires, to hone their skills, and to build the confidence they need to act on their impulses. For Dahmer, the line between fantasy and reality blurred until it disappeared entirely. He was living in a world of his own making, a world where his darkest desires were not just permissible, but celebrated. Psychopathy and antisocial personality. Disorder. The mind of a monster. Jeffrey Dahmer was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and psychotic disorder. But many experts believe he also exhibited traits consistent with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. These disorders are characterized by a profound lack of empathy, a disregard for the rights of others, and a pattern of manipulative and exploitive behavior. Individuals with these disorders often have a history of criminal behavior, substance abuse, and difficulty maintaining relationships. Psychopaths, in particular, are known for their superficial charm, their ability to lie and manipulate others, and their complete lack of remorse for their actions. They often see others as objects to be used for their own gratification, rather than as human beings with feelings and rights. Dahmer certainly displayed many of these traits. He was able to lure his victims with a facade of normalcy, using his seemingly harmless appearance and persuasive manner to gain their trust. He showed no remorse for his crimes, often describing them in a detached and clinical manner. He viewed his victims as objects, as playthings to be used and discarded at will. While not all individuals with antisocial personality disorder or psychopathy become serial killers, these disorders can create a predisposition to violence and a disregard for the consequences of one's actions. In Dahmer's case, these traits, combined with other psychological issues and his dark fantasies, created a deadly combination. It's important to understand that these diagnoses are not excuses for his behavior. They don't absolve him of responsibility for his crimes. However, they do offer a framework for understanding the complex interplay of factors that may have contributed to his descent into darkness. They help us to see that Dahmer was not simply a monster who emerged from nowhere. He was a product of a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that shaped his development and ultimately led him down a path of unimaginable horror. Necrophilia and cannibalism. The ultimate taboos, perhaps the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's crimes, were his acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. These acts are considered the ultimate taboos in almost every culture, and they are often associated with the most extreme forms of psychopathology. Necrophilia, the sexual attraction to corpses, is a rare and poorly understood paraphilia. It is often linked to a desire for complete control and a fear of rejection. In Dahmer's case, his necrophilic acts may have been a way for him to exert ultimate power over his victims, to possess them completely, even in death. It was a way to ensure that they could never leave him, never reject him. Cannibalism, the act of consuming human flesh, is even more taboo and is often associated with ritualistic practices or extreme survival situations. In Dahmer's case, his cannibalism appears to have been driven by a desire to merge with his victims, to make them a part of him. He stated that he ate the hearts and muscles of some of his victims because he believed it would make them a permanent part of him, both physically and spiritually. It was a twisted form of intimacy, a way to achieve a level of connection that he was unable to attain in any other way. These acts are not just shocking, they are deeply symbolic. They represent the ultimate violation of the human body, the ultimate transgression of social norms. They are a testament to the depths of Dahmer's depravity and the extent to which he had become detached from reality and from any sense of human decency. They are also a reminder that the human mind is capable of unimaginable horrors, that the darkness within us can sometimes take on a life of its own, leading us down paths that we never thought possible. The zombie experiments, a twisted quest for control one of the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's crimes was his attempt to create submissive zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains. This wasn't just torture. It was a twisted experiment, a macabre attempt to create a living being completely under his control. He wanted a companion who would never leave, never argue, never reject him, a being entirely at his mercy. This highlights his profound loneliness and his desperate need for control, a need so strong it manifested in these horrific acts. He was not a scientist. He was not driven by any legitimate scientific curiosity. He was driven by a desperate, twisted need to control and possess another human being, to mold them into his perfect, submissive companion. 5. The aftermath and conclusioning. Remembering the victims and preventing future tragedies. The arrest and conviction of Jeffrey Dahmer brought an end to his reign of terror. But the impact of his crimes continues to be felt today. The case exposed deep flaws in the criminal justice system, sparked a national conversation about the treatment of marginalized communities, and spurred research into the minds of serial killers. As we conclude this difficult journey, it's crucial to remember the victims, to honor their memories, and to learn from the mistakes of the past. The Dahmer case is a stark reminder that the impact of violent crime extends far beyond the immediate victims. It ripples outwards, affecting families, friends, and entire communities. It leaves a void that can never be filled, a wound that can never fully heal. For the families of Dahmer's victims, the pain and suffering caused by his crimes will never fully disappear. They were forced to endure not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the horrific details of their deaths, which were splashed across headlines around the world. They had to live with the knowledge that their sons, brothers, and friends had been subjected to unimaginable torture and degradation. Their grief, anger, and sense of betrayal are emotions that will stay with them forever. We must never forget the 17 young men whose lives were so brutally taken: Stephen Hicks, Stephen Toomey, Jamie Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, Edward W. Smith, Ernest Miller, David C. Thomas, Curtis Straughter, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Conorak Synthesophone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. They were more than just names on a list. They were individuals with families, friends, dreams, and aspirations. They deserved to live full and happy lives. Beyond the incalculable personal tragedies, the case exposed systemic failures. The Milwaukee Police Department, in particular, faced intense scrutiny for their handling of the investigation and their interactions with the community, particularly marginalized groups. The tragic case of Conorak Synthesophone, who was returned to Dahmer's custody despite clear signs of distress, became a focal point for criticism and highlighted issues of racial bias and negligence. This incident, along with other shortcomings in the investigation, led to calls for reform with the department, including improved training on diversity, sensitivity, and the handling of missing persons cases. However, the Dahmer case's impact wasn't limited to just one city or police department. It sparked a national conversation about how law enforcement interacts with different communities and raised questions about how race, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status can influence the way crimes are investigated. It forced a difficult but necessary look at societal prejudices and the importance of equal justice for all. The media's role in covering the case was also complex and, at times, controversial. While providing crucial information to the public, some outlets were criticized for sensationalizing the gruesome details, potentially traumatizing victims, families. This raised important ethical questions about the balance between the public's right to know and the responsibility to avoid causing further harm. Despite the darkness, the Dahmer case has contributed to advancements in forensic psychology. Researchers have studied his actions and motivations, leading to a better understanding of the minds of serial killers. This knowledge has helped refine profiling techniques, improve risk assessment methods, and inform prevention strategies. While we can never fully understand what drives someone to commit such horrific acts, the research spurred by this case continues to be invaluable. Ultimately, the legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is a dark one, but it can also serve as a catalyst for positive change. By confronting the darkness, by understanding the factors that contribute to such extreme forms of violence, and by working together to build a more just and compassionate society, we can hope to prevent future tragedies. This means addressing systemic issues within law enforcement, investing in mental health care, and fostering communities where everyone feels safe and valued. We must commit ourselves to creating a society where all citizens are treated with dignity and respect. We must learn from the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long. We must remember the victims, not just as names, but as individuals whose lives were tragically cut short. By remembering them, and by working to build a better future, we can ensure that their deaths were not in vain. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey. Please remember to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into true crime cases, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Your support helps us continue to bring these crucial stories to light. Until next time, take care.